Today we're diving into one of the absolute strangest, most backward stories in all of rock and roll. It's the story of the Zombies, a band that, believe it or not, had to break up before it could ever really become famous.
I mean, just think about that for a second. Imagine you pour everything you have into your music, and it just doesn't work out. So you call it quits. You all go your separate ways, and then, after it's all over, one of your songs just becomes this global phenomenon. This isn't some made-up scenario. It's the real, totally improbable story of the Zombies.
So in 1969, this song was absolutely everywhere. Time of the season. It was one of the anthems of the late 60s. You know, a psychedelic pop masterpiece that really helped define that whole era. It climbed all the way to number 3 on the Billboard charts in the US, a massive, undeniable hit.
And here is the unbelievable part. By the time America was completely obsessed with that song, the Zombies had already been broken up for over a year. The band members had moved on, they had regular jobs, they'd pretty much accepted that their rock and roll dream was over. So how on earth did that happen?
Well, to really get a handle on the end of their story, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning. See, this wasn't some band that was manufactured by a record label. This was just a group of friends who got together while they were still in school. The year is 1962. We're in St. Albans, England, and the 5 original members were all just teenagers. In fact, the story goes that for their very first rehearsal, they had to meet up outside a pub because none of them were old enough to legally go inside and get a pint. They started out calling themselves the Mustangs, which is a pretty standard name for that time, but they were about to pick a name that was anything but.
Yeah, the origin of their name is just as weird as the rest of their story. It was their original bassist, Paul Arnold, who just threw out the name The Zombies. The other guys, including the lead singer Colin Blunstone, kind of just went with it. Blunstone admitted later he didn't even really know what a zombie was. He just thought it sounded cool and unique. And you know what? He was right.
So their career starts with a massive bang. In 1964, their very first single, She's Not There, becomes this huge international hit. It goes to number 2 in the US, sells over 1 million copies. They were a certified hit machine for about 5 minutes. For the next 3 years, pretty much every single they released just fizzled out. It didn't make a dent on the charts, and you can imagine how frustrating that was for them. But here's the thing. Just because they weren't selling records doesn't mean the music wasn't good. In fact, critics and other musicians knew that this band was something really special. As the music critic Richie Unterberger said, besides maybe giants like the Beatles or the Beach Boys, no mid-60s rock group wrote melodies as gorgeous as those of the Zombies. The quality was there, no doubt. The sales, not so much. So by 1967, the band was just running on fumes. They were frustrated, they were broke, and they decided to go into the studio one last time to make one final album, to do it exactly the way they wanted to. Kind of like a farewell statement.
This photo right here, it captures the band at that exact moment. You can see they're full of creative energy, but they're right on the verge of giving it all up. They were about to channel all that frustration and all their talent into one last, spectacular album. They managed to book time at the legendary Abbey Road Studios, right after the Beatles had finished recording Sgt. Pepper. Their budget was basically non-existent. They even used a Mellotron keyboard that John Lennon had just left behind. The songwriters Rod Argent and Chris White literally had to pay for the stereo mixes out of their own pockets. And then, in December 1967, with the album finished but not even out yet, they officially broke up.
When the album Odessey and Oracle was finally released in the UK in April of '68, it just landed with a thud. I mean, terrible sales, no hits, nothing. It really seemed like their final artistic statement was just going to be completely forgotten. And that, it seemed, was the end of the story.
But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because a really strange series of events was about to unfold over in America, giving the band a massive hit single from Beyond the Grave.
This timeline really just spells out how absurd the whole thing was. Okay, so December '67, they split up. April '68, their big album totally flops in their own country. Then nearly a whole year later, March of '69, a song from that flop album, Time of the Season, becomes one of the biggest songs in the United States. It was a smash hit for a band that didn't even exist anymore.
So naturally, when you have a hit that big, people in America wanted to see the band live. Promoters wanted to book them on a tour. There was just one tiny problem. There was no band to book. But this demand led to one of the most bizarre cons in the history of music.
Let me introduce you to the fake Zombies. Yes, you heard that right. A promotions agency literally hired random musicians, told them to learn the songs, and then sent them out on the road pretending to be the real British band. And it wasn't just one fake band. At one point, there were at least 2 different groups calling themselves the Zombies touring the US at the same time.
And now we get to the truly wild part. When the real Zombies were asked to get back together for a tour, they said no, so the fake bands hit the road. Incredibly, the Texas version of the fake Zombies featured a bassist named Dusty Hill and a drummer, Frank Beard, who would, just a little while later, go on to form the legendary band ZZ Top. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up.
So you've got these fake bands touring around, the real members are off doing completely different things. So what happened to their actual legacy? Well, it took a while. A long while.
If you look at this timeline of who was in the band and when, you see this enormous gap after 1967. For decades, the band was basically dormant, even as their reputation was quietly, slowly, starting to grow in the background. So while the original guys were working as record execs, insurance clerks, and solo artists, something really remarkable was happening. Odessey and Oracle, that album that failed so badly, was being rediscovered by whole new generations of musicians and fans. It went from a bargain bin flop to a critically adored, super influential cult classic. And eventually, the legend grew so big that the surviving members actually did reunite. And here they are, performing that very album to sold-out, adoring crowds, something they could have only dreamed of when they first recorded it all those decades ago before breaking up.
Which brings us to this year, just a single powerful number that really represents the final, incredible chapter in this story.
In 2019, 52 years after they decided to call it a day, the Zombies got rock and roll's highest honor. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a final, definitive, you made it, for their incredible talent and their completely one-of-a-kind legacy.
So, what's the takeaway here? The story of the Zombies leaves us with this really fascinating question about art and business and time. How long does it really take for a masterpiece to get the recognition it deserves? For the Zombies, the answer was about half a century. And their story is proof that sometimes the time of the season for success, well, it just takes a little while to get there.